So, Father, if you could start us off on this 20th encounter with a prayer, and then go ahead with your presentation, and then we'll see how things go from there.
Okay, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of the Wisdom, pray for us.
Pray for us. Pray for us.
Okay, we share my screen, and then is that okay?
Looks good.
Okay. Okay, I have to start from there. So I'm talking about the article of Father Fehlner. So it's very interesting, as you can imagine. It's very difficult at the same time, because we have many topics in the same words, and the description of Father Fehlner is, according to me, is very clear and even very precise on the critique he has to do on Rahner mentality and Rahner theology. So it's of course it's a critique based on Bonaventure and Scotus' point of view, but even we could say that it's scholastic point of view on we could say Transcendental Thomism, but it's something we're going to see many details and many different arguments. So that's why it's very difficult to synthesize, to give the synthesis. I will start with this quotation from the article. And the three topics that are in the article are this, especially are the A-thematic knowledge of God. So we're going to explain what is it. Then there's a distinction between economic and immanent Trinity. So it's the second part of the article. And I will not enter into this argument of the Trinity because it's too much. And even my argument today will be on the knowledge, and it will be too much even for just the knowledge. So I will cut maybe my intervention in 3 or 4 parts. And one of the topics which is very important in this article is it's a non-metaphysical approach of Rahner based on the renewal of the Christology. So everybody knows that there were 2 Christologies that were opposed from the I and from the law. So the 2 Christology were in confrontation. So basically, Karl Rahner, with all this renewal of the theology in the 30s or 40s, last century, tried to give his answer. And we also know that Karl Rahner was trying to give an answer with his famous book, Corso the Theology Courses. It was temptative. Is that possible, this word? Okay. To give an answer of faith on the Trinity, on the topic of the faith, which are mysterious, Trinity, incarnation. So it was an attempt, this is the word, an attempt to give an answer to the people living in the 20th century. I will read this quote, and I will ask for you for the next quotation to give me a hand, because it's sometimes it's so maybe the English is not perfect, because sometimes I pick up from the Italian and I put it in the English using Google Translator. It's not so bad, but sometimes. Okay, so I read the text. It means above all that the primary object of theology is not the divine being or the Godhead in itself, apart from any consideration of the non-divine, the immanent Trinity, God in se, rather than pro nobis. Effectively, this is a rejection of Saint Bonaventure's position. So, very clear critique of Karl Rahner's is that the knowing of God, so the esse in se subsistence, so the starting point of the theology for Bonaventure, is not the starting point of Karl Rahner. And we have this topic, it's very important to start from this, because it's a non-metaphysical approach, which is linked to the renewal of Christology at the same time, and the renewal of the theology by some very famous author in the theology. That could be, we could say, for example, Moltmann or Bultmann, this Protestant theology. And at the same time, the Protestant philosophy. We could say Protestant because it was born in Germany, and I'm talking about Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schelling. So all the destruction of the metaphysical approach, and we'll talk about that much more after. Just in a few references I will do on the philosophy that it's important to understand Karl Rahner. Okay, we'll start this this presentation by the Kantian position, because under Rahner we have the Kantian system. For Karl Rahner, the starting point is something initially transcending understanding, a Noumenon, or intellectually speaking, nothing. Rather, as a Transcendental Thomist, and we can make the reference of the famous Jesuit that was his starting point. The name is, I can't get the name, but I will remember.
Maréchal?
It's Maréchal, exactly. So Maréchal has written a book, which is a Thomist book. I read it, but you have to know the Latin. So it's not so easy, and it's an interpretation on Thomas and Scotus. But I deal only with a part of Thomism, and it was very clear. It's a clear book. But so look at this. The position is important to understand that it's a Kantian construction. And here you have the word Noumenon. So it's important to understand that before starting, because I will read you a few words on Noumenon from Kant. What is a Noumenon? Noumenon is something that I'm thinking myself, and I can get the existence in my thinking. So what is it? So the subject is constructing the thought, the thinking, and it's only I that I'm thinking that this is. So there is no existence for Kant in the thinking. It's only myself that will think that my computer is here present, but there is no existence in. I can't prove it. Okay, so this is a Noumenon. The difference is that, or it's not a difference, it's a separation, a splitting that Kant has done between knowing, in Tedesco it's called Erkennen, and from God, because under this is a question of God, as you can understand. I can't know nothing about God, Erkennen. Okay, what does it mean? I can't do any synthesis a priori, because the predication is already inside of the subject. So the existence of God, the being of God is inside of the subject. So I can do it by my mind, okay? But what I can do with God is that I can't know God, but I can think God, denken, okay? So why I can think that God exists? Because it's non-contradictory, okay? So it's a possibility. This is just to give a few intuition on what we have to, when we deal with Kant, what we have to understand on this splitting that he has created. So the mind is much more confused. I can say, for example, I don't know, I will try to do it with you, but I can think that God is God, the word God, but it's not automatically or logically that I can arrive to this existence of God. There is no proof for that. So Kant will district all the proof of the existence of God, ontological, cosmological. He will district all this proof, starting, we can't talk about that, but the famous 100 talari. So it's not because I have 100 talari or I'm thinking of the number that I get it in my pocket. So talari is like having $100. It's not because I'm thinking that the existence is coming after. So it's an interpretation of the Anselm argument and saying that it's not possible to pass from the idea of God to the existence of God. Another point is important, and this is a question of the. I will tell you what. First, there is another distinction in Kant that is important to understand. The intellect is not the reason. Okay, reason is much more the process, dialogical process. Intellect is what will, in some ways, put together the concept. So. Important to understand that for Kant there is a priori. A priori means that the science needs to be universal. So we have to have this concept which are a priori, elaborated by the mind, with the time and space categories, which are categories linked to our sensibility. Sensibility is something very important for Kant, because he wants to recreate and refunded the science on empirical statements. So it means mathematical, geometrical, so as Hume has done before him. So for Kant, only the phenomena can be known. And when we are talking about metaphysics, as a science, he says, no, there is no way. Metaphysics can't be a science. So phenomena is different from Noumenal. Phenomena, what my senses are telling me, to summarize. And the phenomena is what is appearing. For example, I'm appearing on your screen, so it's my phenomena that is appearing, my voices. But the Noumenal, which is the thing in itself, or far, how you say that in oltre in Italian also, if you can help me, Brother Charles, oltre, which means far away from this. So
above,
yeah, above,
or beyond,
or beyond, far beyond, yes. For example, you have my face on the screen, but you can't never know that I am. Your mind is not concretely created so that you can pass from the phenomena of Brother Joseph to his Noumenal. So there is always a part of mysterious that the mind will never understand, and you can't arrive to the concrete, we could say, by the reason, to the concrete statement or judgment that Father Joseph is existing in the reality. So it's important to understand that, because it's not that Kant wants to destruct metaphysics as a project. It's just that the limit of the knowing world is ourself. Everything has to be referred to ourself, to the, we can say the word is transcendental ego, transcendental I. And it's important to understand that for understanding Rahner. Transcendental is a very, it has been interpreted in many ways, but we have to be, when I'm talking today on transcendence, I will talk on transcendence on knowledge. So which is not the transcendent being that we are for Rahner and for the people who in the theology that are talking about the being, but I will start from the transcendental in the knowledge. So what does it mean for Kant? It's a condition of possibility. So condition of possibility, why? Because it's all referred to the I that is elaborated the data, or not the concept, but the data, which means we put together my sensibility, my senses, my sensibility, the apprehension I have from the reality, and I will re-actualize it or re-elaborate it in my own subject. So you understand that it's important to have this background to understand what is the Transcendental Thomism. Because I will start to explain you, starting from a book that of my teacher that was explaining what is it, freedom and all the topics from a Rahnerian mind. And it's, of course, it's linked on, is based on Kantian mind, but it's not all the Kantian mind, because Rahner has done his own interpretation of this. I found very interesting to understand this, that what Father Fehlner talks as the anthropological shift, which means we are not starting from the theology as what is the essence of God, but it's all starting from what the subject is thinking about God. So we call that the anthropological shift. But from my point of view as a student in the Gregorian, we have two interpretations we can give of the anthropological shift, because there's a good anthropological shift, which means let's start in theology from, we can use modern science as psychology, pedagogy, to understand what is a man. When God creates man, what does it mean? So a theology of creation. And the bad side of the transcendentalism is that everything is, all the theology has to start from man. And what is, according to me, the thing that is underneath is a Christology, because some of the, we can have some later topic on this, the renewal of the Christology. And we can talk about, I don't know, Jean Gallo, for example, or Schoenberg, which is very important to understand why it has changed. But this theologian from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and after the Second Concile, they try to understand why Jesus is man, is humanity. What is his humanity? If we say that he's real God and real man. So they try to understand what is the psychology of Jesus, how he was dealing with his mind. So it's all the question that were at the beginning of the story of the church, but that has been readapted for the century. After that, we discover many science, and especially psychology, Freudian psychology, Hegelianism, Kantianism, Nietzsche, all these philosophical works that has influenced the theology. But I will not remain on this topic because maybe it's a bit boring. I don't know. But the important point is that we are talking with a theologian. So the question of the revelation will be important in Karl Rahner. And I will read you that what I read, I can't remember if it's my own, or maybe it is the writing of Father Fehlner. So what is saying Father Fehlner? All theological understanding is consequent and on and conditioned by spiritual experience of absolute transcendence, which Rahner identifies with divine revelation. So have you seen that? So Karl Rahner is doing a step above. He is saying the absolute transcendence, we can say that is divine revelation. So have you understood this passage? It's a passage from the transcendental being or knowledge to the divine revelation. Okay, knowledge. So it's already an interpretation of Kant. Knowledge of this revelation is consequent upon this primitive experience and is a theologoumenon rather than faith or part of faith itself. Hence, thematic statements in theology, dogmatic proposition are culturally conditioned and so not absolutely valid explanation, theologoumena, of this radically athematic and preconceptual experience. For understanding these words, I have to start to pass to this other slide. Why? Because you have listening to this word theologoumenon. Theologoumenon, what is it? So for people who are not, even I take this definition from Wikipedia, so no worries. It's the lowest quality we can get, but it's very clear, so it's okay. At the bottom of the page, a theologoumenon is a theological statement or concept that lacks absolute doctrinal authority. It is commonly defined as a theological assertion or statement not derived from divine revelation, or a theological statement or concept in the area of individual opinion rather than of authoritative doctrine. An example, Bultmann, for example, retains that Jesus that is walking on the sea it's a theologoumena. And you can understand even the Protestant critic of, for example, if you talk with a Protestant, he will tell you, but you can't talk me about Origen or John Damascene because it's only theologoumena. I prefer my own interpretation of the Bible. So they've done that with the miracle of Jesus in the theology, the Protestant theology, but even Catholic theology for some points, but which are not anymore Catholic, by the way. And at the same time, they say, okay, dogma is only theologoumena. So Immaculate Conception, it's just a point of view. So it's in some way, it's a destruction of the faith in itself. So three hot topics that I start with Protestant topics, and it's kind of everything is inside of this Protestant background. Of course, you understand that. So this is the theologoumenon is a revelation topic of the Protestantism, but we can talk about that later. One of the other point is the destruction of the metaphysics. That Fehlner say that it's in some ways the anthropologism shift is a destruction or is a reconsideration of the metaphysic. When I say metaphysic, is that with metaphysics we are starting from the essence of God, so from the being of God, as Bonaventure and Scotus. When we quit the metaphysic, why? When does it start? But it starts from Descartes' idealism, res cogitans, res extensa, so separation of the splitting of the mind. So the idealism is born with Descartes. Then we have Berkeley in England. So to summarize on knowledge, the Berkeley vision is an anti-realistic vision. Real is whatever can be felt directly or straightly. So substance, there is no substance, okay, for Berkeley. I don't know if it's a caricature of Berkeley, but it's what I take from my writings in philosophy. And then we arrive to Hume. Hume is an answer to Berkeley. And Hume is saying there is no causes. There is no universal and necessary bond between cause and effect. It's only a psychological associative process of the mind which associates facts together. And Hume was saying, for example, I can't state that, for example, the sun will rise on tomorrow. I can't say that because I don't know it. I can't know it. Why? Because I can only know the succession of time, but not the complexity of time. So you understand that when he was dealing with the objective knowledge, is split with subjective, is split from subjective knowledge with these thinkers. So maybe, for example, you are, for Hume, I'm talking, but you can't touch me. So you will say, okay, it's not Father Joseph. It's just another, it's because I can only hear him, but I will not have the proof that his existence in this real time is here. So it's maybe a phantasm. So it's very clear, it's very close from, we could say, this, it's not heresy, but it's kind of, okay, Buddhism. It's very nirvana, you understand? It's not the same, but it's close in some ways, it's close. And then the last topic is personal experience of the world. So phenomenon is against noumenon. For, so I will read that. The transcendental ego of man, grounded in what Kant calls the autonomous will. So for, just to understand Kant on the will and intelligence, or intellect, there is a repristination of the intellect, and what Kant said about the intellect is that it's production of truth, And what is will for Kant is, we have to understand it like as a cogito from Descartes, which is absolute. So the subject is re-elaborating from in an absolute way. So there's no more God that will illuminate the mind, or even the object are related to the subject, but it is the subject that is the basis of the elaboration of the knowing. And it's in some ways it's a kind of creatrix intelligence, which is, in some ways, Kant is saying to every human person that you are God, because you can re-elaborate, and only you can re-elaborate the reality. So you have the power of God. So Kant is very complex, and Kant is a pietist. So he is a very faithful man. So we have to understand that. It's not someone who doesn't believe in God. He truly believes in God, but as a pietist. So it's special phase. So the transcendental, the other citation from the Father Peter Fehlner article, the transcendental infinite or extramental noumenon, commonly called God or Father, is beyond all perception and conceptualization. So these words, extramental noumenon, maybe we will deal that with you, Dr. Goff. But in some ways, knowing God is not possible for, you can think on the idea of God there are three categories that are reorganizing the mind, which is the mind is automatically doing these three categories, which are soul, world, and God. So we can prove that I can't prove that I have the soul, but it's an containers of my concept that I put inside. And why I put it inside? Because the world is giving me this object, and I put him inside my concept of God and soul, and only faith, in some ways, only faith can give me the link to the Noumenal for Kant. It's my interpretation, but in some ways because he was believing in God. So sorry for this explanation of Kant, but we have to deal with him. I will pass to maybe this article. Okay, someone could read this. This is a program of the article. This is the words of Father Fehlner, and it's a summary of what I've already said. So if someone can just read that in a better English than mine, it will be okay.
Sure. Hence, the first premise of the new theology is the mystical, or from a scholastic viewpoint, the pseudo-mystical. The second premise, the declaration that the patristic scholastic tradition is merely relative and now dead and deadening, may be called the historical premise. And the third premise, or the anthropological shift, is the psychological premise. Two things are accomplished on the basis of this. The metaphysical premise of the scholastic theology, with the divine being in itself as primary object, either ipsum esse subsistens or ens infinitum is liquidated, and the new theology, or transcendental Christology, is articulated.
Thank you. I was explaining this, by the way, just before. So there's really a question of Christology that is very important. And when we have these studies of Christology in my university, it was very interesting when you deal with Christology, you deal with the center of our faith. And because we are Franciscan, so Franciscan means that there is a Christocentrism. So I will not agree that it's the only way, because maybe you could we can talk about a Trinitarian centrism is even okay for me. I mean, there's no problem, but Christocentrism is a Franciscan way. And when we start thinking about who is the person of the verb, of the logos, we have to understand how far, how we can put his humanity linked to his divinity. So doing this shift, which is anthropological shift at the beginning, starting from the Christology, we have a new theology. And when you are studying in Rome, you can even understand that it's something that has spread in on all the aspect of the theology. So when Father Fehlner is saying that, it's a very deep sentence. It's a critic to the theology as it is for now. But I will not say that everything is negative, and I will show you why. And maybe we can have a balanced judgment at the end of this intervention. So there is a new definition of freedom with Karl Rahner. And freedom, what is it? It is to be entrusted to oneself, to himself. It has been traduced like to himself, but someone is entrusted to oneself. Are you understanding the word? It's okay for that? Entrusted. And then it's a freedom that passes through the mediation of the world and the corporeal story, material story, if you want, and is mediated to itself. So this polarity between transcendental freedom and its objectification category leads to a concealment of the first in the second, always leaving freedom in a condition of ambivalence. So the critique of Father Fehlner is that if you know very well Kant and Hegel, in these words, in this sentence, you can understand that it's a dialogical process. So behind all of this, there is a dialectic of Hegel, and it's started from Kant. So what does it mean concretely? Because we have to do it concretely. So story is not something, is a very important category. Why? The story is changing myself. It's a process, the process of the story. As I am someone who is, or everybody is inside of the story, has to be informed by the story. So the story is beginning in some ways, something we could say kind of revelation for everybody. We can say that. So the story is something that it will give you some lights on who is God. So it's interesting because we are not starting from, okay, my soul is immortal, and or God exists, but I am in the world, and as this is really in philosophy, this is existentialism. If you remember Heidegger, you are how you said that, you are
thrown into being.
Yeah, you are put it in the world, so they you are pushed in the world. So existentialism is a negation of free will, or the primitive yes that every soul is giving to God when he first sees the light of God at the moment of the creation of the soul. There is no participation of the yes of the soul. And it's only you, Sartre and Heidegger, so you are pushed in the world, so you haven't choose to be in the world. So existentialism, which has started from, it's not a case, it's not a fortune, we say that Kierkegaard is the father of the existentialism, and the angoscia, I don't know the word in English, but it is the condition of man. So whatever you do, it will be always. Oh, you say that?
I think the English is angst.
Angst. Okay. So man is angst by nature in some ways. So, but it's more complex than this. But so it means that for Karl Rahner, let's have this definition. Being free is not the ability to perform free acts, but freedom is instead given to us to find the permanent and the necessary. So it's not that liberty is not anymore, freedom is not anymore the capacity of oneself, as a Thomist definition would say, to decide himself for good thing, okay? But it becomes the faculty of the eternal and tendency to definitivity. Behind this, for Karl Rahner, there is I think I can imagine that the virtue will lead you to God. So in some ways, in your process of life, then you have to arrive to a definitivity in your soul, in your conviction, in your knowledge, so that the historical process will lead you to definitivity. And freedom is already eternity. In which way? In the way that you can already be, I don't know, virtuous, and it could be for forever. For example, I don't know, I'm maybe for now I'm a very greedy one or lazy one, and then I get my virtue, and I'm not anymore lazy, for example. So freedom for him is something that everything or nothing for Karl Rahner. So when we read the text of Karl Rahner, when we talk about the freedom, it's not anymore Thomist vision as it has been in the past. So free acts, free will. So it's something much more. It's much more a process. I'm not saying it's bad or good, but it's much more in the dialectical part of the life, and this is a big differences. So maybe together we will understand why it has changed our conception of life or theology of free will in our theology. But it's something different. We can say it's not, I don't know if it's good or bad, but I haven't my opinion for now, but I'm trying to understand. So what will mean for us transcendental freedom? So I take this from the book of my teacher in Rome. So if someone can read the text, please.
Sure. Human freedom is not exercised starting from nothing, but is starting from the trends prior to it. This is not reduced either. It primarily consists in the ability to choose over this or that finite good on one or another thing external to ourselves, but in opting for ourselves, in orienting our tendencies, and with this configure of our existence. Freedom, therefore, tends towards finality. Being free is not configured as possession of a faculty, which in itself is always neutral, like capacity to perform single acts.
Thank you, Andrew. So it's very clear. So I mean, we are talking about existence, so we can find a trace of existentialism here. And these words are very strong, of a faculty which in itself is always neutral. So this is very strong. I mean, for us who are reflecting on, I don't know, conscience in Noumenon, or in Bonaventure, we are talking about always co-intuition. So is there a neutral process in the man? So it's maybe much more Scotist, I don't know, because natural knowledge is what Scotus tried to put. Neutrality in some ways, he tried to put the ball at the center. But we understand that in these words, we understand that the anthropological shift is real. Why? Because as you just mentioned before, but in opting for ourselves, in orienting our tendencies, and with this configure our existence. So you can really understand why in the Catholic Church we are talking about the values much more than even the democracy, because we are not anymore in, we could say, democracy anymore, but we are still defending in the Catholic Church the values of, we could say, freedom, or we could say even solidarity, even if the church don't like this word, but I mean equality between people, for example. So it's a value, and the church is saying it's good to defend the values. But when we are doing with the values, we are dealing with a kind of philosophy even. If you take, for example, John Paul II, who has studied Max Scheler, if you read the text of Max Scheler on the values, the question is very underneath, because dealing with values, we are dealing even with Kantian moralism or Kantian morality. So values is not something that we have to, it's a very deep subject. But for going back to my subject, anthropological shift is in some ways is already present here in this statement, because we understand that man is at the center. So it's not, some theologians say, okay, after the Second Vatican Council, we start with this man at the center and God was outside of this. So I'm not saying it's a right definition, but it's a common feeling that some theologian has already talked about. So I have three other definitions that I will talk about on the Rahner vocabulary. So what is creaturality? It is not a starting point, but the situation of the and his own time. So this is very existentialist as a definition. Not the starting point, I mean, we are not dealing with God that creates a man at the image and similarities. But we are like we have done with Bonaventure, but the situation here and now of the man. Then transcendental experience, what is it? It's an inevitable presence in human existence, disclosed man It discloses man and at the same time entrusts him to himself, both in the science as much as in action. This is very clear that here we are, self. The self is very important, but self. I can't remember the philosopher that talking always about that, but it's self-interpretation, self-knowing. So everything. This is idealism in German. And then the person, for Rahner, the person implies the freedom, which is self-possession, identity with oneself or with himself. So, okay, this is a cornice or the square that I wanted to give you for understanding what is this changing in the Rahner mind. So we just say that metaphysics has been cancelled. So what does it mean in concrete words? Is that only starting from the transcendental experience, the subject can be defined on the basis of its relationality and ontological consistency. So the word important here is relationality. So maybe someone could read the text on the right side, so please. Everybody's sleeping.
Being a person, it means that every individual in the totality of the universe has a unique and irreplaceable place, a place defined only through him. But none of us can have our own place without one space in which other individuals have theirs, and it is only in this original space of relationship that we discover ourselves as person, or persone. Our being person is not given to us before being person of the other.
Thank you. So in these words, we can understand that existence or essence is not given by the essence of man, but it has to be given by other person. So it's quite good, but it's not everything, we could say. It's in theology we call that interpersonal. Even in God we have this. So the other person are defined because of the relationship with the other, but we also know that God the Father is a non-begotten, or is not generated. It's a-generated. So both are together. So we have identity at this and a relationship in the Trinity. So we can't build a theology only with relationality. So, but in the Karl Rahner experience, so transcendental experience, it's very important relationality as well. Okay, this is I've nearly finished my my intervention. I wanted you to read this writing of Karl Rahner, so to understand what is this mentality in the transcendental experience and A-thematic knowledge of God. If someone can read that, please.
Okay. To arrive at the definition of transcendental experience, one must start from the nature of knowledge. In every act of knowledge of the subject, it captures, in addition to what it knows, also itself. Then this con-knowledge of the knowing subject, con-knowledge subjective, A-thematic, present in every act of spiritual knowledge, necessary and ineliminable, as well as in its openness to boundless amplitude of all possible reality, a transcendental experience is determined by us. It is an experience because this knowledge of an A-thematic but inevitable nature is the moment and condition of the possibility of any concrete experience of some object. Let's say it is a transcendental experience, because it is part of the necessary and unavoidable structures of the subject's acquaintance and because it consists precisely in overcoming a certain group of objects in the overcoming of the categorial or the categorical.
Thank you, Andrew. So in this word, we understand that the A-thematic, as I understand it, is that it's the question of neutrality in the position of man in the world. And then it's always about experience. So experience, when we say experience, we have to understand that it's a phenomenon. Experience is that I can't understand nothing for Kant unless I have the phenomenon of the thing. So I can't understand this conference without my computer. But if I'm alone in my room, I will not understand this because I have not anymore contact with the senses on this conference. So you understand that behind this underness, it's a question which is metaphysical, a vision of metaphysics, a vision of man and vision of the knowledge. So maybe I will, I hope Dr. Goff will tell us a few more words on A-thematic, because maybe it's linked with Bonaventure. I don't know, I'm just saying that to launch something, to start a discussion, but it's A-thematic. Is that possible knowledge for Franciscan or Bonaventure or Scotist? We will try to understand, but by the way, in this world, we understand that Karl Rahner is trying to talk to the people, is contemporary. So the people who are living at the same period of time, which were after Nietzsche in the Europe of, in the German Europe of Rahner. So it was after Nietzsche, after nihilism, after the start, Einstein discovery. So all this kind of this language of Rahner show us that there is in mankind, in Europe, I would say, there is a change in, so everything is based on the subject. What is important is the subject. So it's something, okay, we can say that, we can do that, but is that giving more faith to the people, or is that something that is not convincing? I don't know. Let's keep open the question. This is the answer of Father Fehlner that I found, and the critique of Father Fehlner I found. So if someone can read the page, please.
For Rahner, transcendental has reference, not in the first instance to the real in itself, insofar as it does not fall into one of the categories of being, but to the ability of the mind to transcend the horizons of conscious experience, of objectification in the Kantian sense. Therefore, to reach the transintelligible. Kant says the pure reason cannot do this in any definitive way. Rahner claims it can, but both agree that the human ego transcending and the divine Noumenon, commonly called God, remain simply incomprehensible, because thought, as such, is not a transcendental apart from a center of consciousness. This is exactly what Thomists and Scotus both deny on the basis of the concept of being employed by the Creator as a vehicle to reveal himself as Savior. Kant, and after him, Rahner, reject any absolute validity for the is in dogmatic propositions.
Thank you, Brother Charles. So, I mean, it's very clear. This destruction of the being, of the thought of the being, is very important for them, and it has consequences very important. And from my, I wanted to tell you about being in, because maybe I will finish with that. We talk about the knowledge for Kant and then Rahner in a few sentences, but it's always about the knowledge. But for Kant, Kant says that the esse, so existence of the being, is only thinkable. Is that correct word? Thinkable. So I can only think about it and not knowing it. Why? Because we only have the a priori. Okay. It said that is that possible to prove that the being is not existing, that something is not existing? Kant say no. We can only have the intuition of the contrary. So this is exactly the if someone knows, it is the antinomies of Kant. So there is something that we can't understand. For example, one example is God is infinite, infinity of God. So if infinity of the universe, it's an antinomy. We can say yes or no. So there are 4 antinomies on the word, for example. So Kant is very impressive because he's not telling you there is no God. He's just saying it's a very agnostic way of thinking. It's just there is maybe God is a possibility, and your mind can thinking as a possible, but you will never put together existence of God and the idea, the concept of God you have in the mind. You can't put it together because you can't get this by the senses. You can't get the phenomenon of God. So what we have to do is kind of the position of Husserl. We have to suspend our judgment. We have to say, okay, maybe there is, and it's a question of faith. And it's exactly the same process as on being. So is that possible for me to know the being? No, because it's a noumenal, so it's mysterious. And so in some ways, it's the abdiction of the possibility of thinking in the classic neo-scholastic or classic metaphysics on what is God, who is God, his power, his humility, his knowledge, his wisdom. So it's not any more important because we can only thinking and we will never know it. So yeah, I don't know if I make you understand the proposition. One word I have put under this. So I finish with the because we get okay. When a last word on this is that when we say that it's incomprehensible, okay, this word is under this. So Father Fehlner said, the divine Noumenon. Noumenon it's when we heard Noumenon, we have to think about Hume, okay? That's it. We can't know the causes of something, causes with a big C. Commonly called God remains simply incomprehensible. So when we say incomprehensible for in the Rahner or Kantian, it's like you can only think about it. So it's only a thinking, elaboration of the mind. So it's really linked to the proof of the existence of God. One last word, and then I really finish this. It was, so maybe we'll lose it. Okay, it's here. We always talk about, it's very interesting to deal with Kant because we understand many things of the philosophy. So I was trying to get the adjective pure. When in Kant there is always this the adjective pure, because we have the intuition that are pure, and this pure intuition are time and space. Okay. And okay, I can't find it. Okay. This is time and space. And when we say, okay, maybe this will help us to understand more. Pure, it's a form, a priori form. So if it's not pure, so it's without time and space. If it's not pure and a priori, it will be a posteriori, so after a while, and it's non-pure. And this is important because it's the way that Kant is saying this. For example, you are doing with your mind a synthetic judgment a priori. For example, when I'm saying 1 + 2 = 4, it's a synthetic judgment a priori, because I can understand, I can split all the numbers and I can do it by my mind. But if you don't have this, you can't do real science for Kant, because you can't do mathematical or geometrical. So when I'm saying God, for example, I can get this word as a science because I can't split his temporal moment or his spatial moment, because the mind is done for space and time. So I can get the idea of God with the existence of God in my mind. So I will only know that I can think the word, but I will never get the existence of God. So I can't have the face using only my mind. And this is important because at the very end, we are falling, maybe I will finish by this statement, but we are falling into agnosticism. When I was reading this Kantian position, I was really feeling that this is the starting point of the agnosticism, because many of our people who are just saying to us, maybe God is existing, but I will never know it. I will never know him. So it doesn't matter if it exists or not, because I can't really know it. And this is common position in the people that we are we're trying to evangelize or to pray for them. Many of them are saying there is no need of this question, and in some way it has been resolved, or it has been checked or defined well by Kant. So we don't need this question anymore. So it's a very bad starting point of from the idealism in Germany. Thank you very much for your patience, and I give the words to Brother Charles.
I guess we would just move into general discussion now. If anybody has any observations.
Well, yes, thank you, Father Joseph. In terms of the concern, I think you very helpfully laid out the philosophical bases of Rahner and his appropriation of Kantian categories into the realm of theology, especially with respect to the distinction between the natural existential and the supernatural existential, which is basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, the natural existential is this transcendental relation or kind of innate disposition to what did you call it? Definitiveness or definity, or to the infinite. And then through the mediation of experience, which Rahner, following Kant, takes to be introspective or rational experience through the process of coming to knowledge of individual things, and then coming up with ideas through that process, positing the gracious movement that is manifested in especially the person of our Lord, to this full acceptance of this natural existential, this disposition through experience and the gracious manifestation of the incarnation. Through this process, you arrive at what Rahner calls the supernatural existential, which is basically in Christ, the full acceptance of this disposition or tendency to infinity that is what constitutes the finite creation or person as such. And so I think what is really interesting is the beginning with the A-thematic and ending with the supernatural existential, because it's working through the same medium, the mystery of experience. And this is really what Kant was wrestling with too, is the justification of inferences to universality and necessity on the basis of finite experience. And so Kant understood this, and then he analyzed the processes. So he began with the process of experience introspection, and he arrived at this disjunct, not a disjunct in the sense, or rather I should say a radical separation between the phenomena and the noumena. The noumena in a sense being ultimately A-thematic, because they're, in the words of Rahner, rooted in the incomprehensibility of God the Father himself. And so because of the limitations of our processes, it really is simply impossible on the basis of a finite act, a finite object, and then a finite and thereby unstable judgment to arrive at direct, or what should I say, quitative, or really even intuitive thematic knowledge of things in themselves. And so in a sense then, with this dynamic, the anthropological term really centers in this understanding of the natural existential as having an innate disposition to infinity. And then in order to complete the natural existential, this almost posits by a kind of internal necessity that there would be an incarnation wherein you find an individual that fully accepts this disposition to infinity and thereby is divinized. This is very important, because I think the heart of the critique of and let me take a step back. I think Kant here is dealing with what Father Peter and earlier Father Leone Voite saw as the limitations of Aristotelian philosophical psychology, which moved in to an articulation of metaphysics, because the Aristotelian philosophical psychology, and I think St. Thomas follows him fairly closely here, is that being is primarily predicated of things that are what we might call substances. And substances for Aristotle are inherently related to the 10 categories. You've got substance, quantity, quality, and all of these things, knowledge of all these things are gained through abstraction. So it gives us a very clear way to do science in the mode of terrestrial science. And that's why St. Thomas will say the object of the intellect, or the primary object of the intellect, is the quiddity of material substances, because all knowledge begins with abstraction. But I think what Kant was really critiquing is if you say that being is first said of substantial being, and substantial being is that which is inexorably bound up with categorical being, and thereby categorical being implies substantial existence that is modified by accidents, you're very laying out of the process, and the grounds of our metaphysics is inherently limited. And so how do you, on the basis of this kind of experience, begin to speak of being as such, let alone being or beings that are not able to be situated under the categoricals? And so I think he lays out a genuine concern. And Kant is trying to wrestle with it, and I think he fully adopts the inherent logic of the Aristotelian philosophical psychology, is that it really does, in a sense, lock you into a kind of immanentizing of knowledge. And so really then the difference is that with Aristotle and St. Thomas is that through this process of abstraction, with respect to knowledge of the categories, you do have real knowledge of things in themselves. I think Kant would question that, because he's dealing with the internal processes, and it says, well, how do you actually know your knowledge or your idea? Your process of reasoning terminates in something extramental. And I think the problem is compounded when you move from the categorical to the extramental, but already framed within the categorical, to a discussion of the transcendental, the noumena, So the categorical could be broadly framed under the phenomena. St. Thomas and Aristotle just believe that abstraction terminates in knowledge of universal concepts that come from the process of sensory experience, all the way through the phantasm, the sensible species, the phantasm, the active intellect or the agent intellect, working on the phantasm to draw out the intelligible species, which are the universal species of a kind, and then impress that in the mind. For Aristotle and for St. Thomas, that was valid enough, that worked. But then I do think with St. Thomas, the move is slightly different than what you find in Bonaventure and Scotus, is that in order to explain or articulate how we understand finite being, we have to then immediately go to the analogia entis, the analogy of being. And this is where it becomes a little bit more difficult to articulate consistently in terms of logic, is that how do you move through analogy, wherein you affirm greater dissimilarity than similarity between the categorical being, which in a sense, if the object of the intellect is the quiddity of material substance, coupled with the fact that being is primarily spoken of those beings that are already finite by dint of their containment within categorical being, how do you move to speak of a being completely transcending the categories? So I think Kant is wrestling with something, and I think the move by Rahner was a way to directly address the kind of agnosticism that developed through the acceptance of this kind of anthropology and a prioritizing of the structures and processes of coming to knowledge, making judgment. I think he is trying to respond directly to that. Perhaps the ambiguity in Rahner's own thought is how do you justify or ground upon those bases, upon the basis of experience, a disposition to infinity? Because infinity by definition would already transcend any experiential and or categorical or psychological boundaries. And so in a sense, in order to preserve Christianity and what is taught authoritatively about God, the Trinity in himself, but also about the person of Christ as possessing a divine nature, being a divine person, it seems very difficult from within the horizon of psychological experience alone to even justify this kind of innate disposition that is perhaps known intuitively and a-thematically. Because, I mean, Father Peter says, really what the object of being in itself as a-thematic is really contentless. It has no quiddative content. You're not really saying anything about it. And so in that sense, it's uninformative. And so I think Father Peter's critique would be ultimately that Rahner's was a valiant attempt to appropriate and then Christianize Kantian epistemology as it is refracted and worked out through the dialectical thinking of Hegel and the existential thinking of Heidegger. And what the dialectical thinking of Hegel allows him to do is it allows him to have a real process of becoming. And so he said, this can work. We can see an analogy of becoming in the very process of our history, our self-possession, and our opting for that natural existential, that innate disposition for infinity. And then the value for Rahner, it seems to me, of Heidegger, is that it gives this very existential thrust. And so in a sense, he can say we're thrown into being or thrown into the world. And this is a concrete terminus of our own self-possession in the process of history, in the process of coming to ourselves. And because we know, or because we believe that Christ manifested the supernatural existential, we can have faith that this supernatural existential and this intuition of the natural existential actually does come from a benevolent God who is looking to diffuse his goodness in creation. But I think getting back to the key point is that the anthropological term has to be located in this prioritization and this seeking to uncover or discover the bounds or limits of reason within a Kantian framework that is implicitly bringing forward, while critiquing, an Aristotelian philosophical psychology that is essentially limited to the horizon of categorical being. If you follow what I'm saying. So that's the mystery. And interestingly, both St. Bonaventure and later Scotus understood this problem. St. Bonaventure in question 4 of the De Mysterio the De Scientia Christi, the questions on the knowledge of Christ, he shows how by the fact that we do have knowledge, and by the fact that we can arrive at certain judgments, it must be the case that knowledge is possible, not only knowledge of the categorical, intramental, but knowledge of the categorical extramental, and not only knowledge of the categorical extramental, but knowledge of being in itself as transcendental. And so this is what he's dealing with. And I think this is the usefulness of the metaphor of light and divine illumination. And this is why functionally, I think Father Peter, and I think he's fairly convincing because other Franciscan thinkers have located this as well, or related it to functionally to Scotus's notion of the univocal concept of being, because they have a similar function insofar as they try to specify what created rationality is as such in its first act, in its very act of being constituted as a creature. And so, getting back to Bonaventure in his metaphor of illumination, Bonaventure says that illumination is the distinct mode of divine concursus that terminates in a rational creature. So this sets up a relationship, not merely of categorical relation or categorical dependency, but of transcendental relation. So the creature exists in an asymmetrical relation with the creator, depending upon the act of that creator to bring and preserve that creature in existence. And so and this gets to something I was interested in commenting on Andrew's presentation from last week, but it also touches right upon the question of a-thematic, because I think there's an inherent ambiguity in a-thematic. Because when Bonaventure and Scotus are speaking of being or illumination, they would grant that being, when it's first known as the mind is created, the created mind constituted as a rational person, they would grant that it's a-thematic insofar as the mind, in the moment it comes into existence, doesn't have knowledge of particular items. So the mind has not gone through any process of experience, either sensorily or intuitively, interiorly, reflexive experience in the mind, and therefore has not come to any abstracted concepts. You see, so the mind comes into being, is created in being, not as knowing dogs and cats and trees and ships and 2 + 2 = 4. But where I think they would differ is that the mind is the concept of being, or this notion of illumination, is not a-thematic in the meaning that it's contentless or meaningless. And this is because they both provide a definition of being, not in terms of a categorical or an Aristotelian definition of genus and difference coming up with a species, but in terms of a truly transcendental concept that is rooted in the very act of being a created rational person. So for Bonaventure, he will say the first act of the created person's existence is to be rational. And thus, in being rational, that created existence has the gift of rationality or understanding or consciousness. And it's first conscious of what? The light of intelligibility, the light of reason. And so Bonaventure simply calls being in this instance that which is in flight from nothingness. And this is very similar to Scotus's definition of being, that which is not contradictory to real esse, real existence, but it doesn't specify any quiddity. So at the point in which one is illuminated or created as a rational creature, the creature is so to speak created with the lights on. So in a sense, the human person is brought into the world with the light of reason on and the necessary sensory faculties, such that, let's say he's brought into the room of the world with the lights on. He can then begin to look around the world, and through experience, abstraction, judgment, and discursive reasoning come to distinct and articulated objectified concepts about finite objects, right? But I think the point here that the scholastics, especially Bonaventure and Scotus, are getting at is that there already is something prior in our very mode of being that constitutes us as rational. And the rationality is thematic with respect to it knows something that is not contrary to actual existence, or it knows being as that which is in flight from non-being. Nevertheless, it's preconceptual insofar as it hasn't named through a finite act of abstraction and judgment any particular finite beings. And this gets us back to the fundamental point for Father Peter and for Bonaventure, Scotus, and also St. Thomas Aquinas through his development of the analogy of being that allows him to transcend the limits, or actually already understands the created person as transcending the limits in its very rationality of finitude, is the priority of consciousness or contemplation. So this innate light of reason, or this intuitive relation, or being thrown into rational being, is the both the metaphysical and ontological constituent of being a rational creature. But it also then, for Bonaventure and Scotus, become the ground or condition of knowing all other things. And so this is why for both Bonaventure and Scotus, illumination and or being functions as a trans-empirical reality that is first known innately in its creation and in its dependency upon God, or intuitively before it's articulated. So the concept, when we name being, it comes through the processes of reasoning. But rationality itself is something constitutive of our very nature, and thus, as rational, we already are born into a state of contemplative receptivity of the light of being, of the light of rationality, even before we begin to realize it. And so at the beginning then, Bonaventure and Scotus will just simply say, the condition for knowing any particular thing is the fact that we know being intuitively by our very constitution, by our very nature as rational, or by the gift of illumination, which is a natural gift to us in the order of created persons. The very condition for knowing any particular thing is this relationship. But then how do you resolve judgments particularly? Because we know being before we name being. But in the very process of naming, right, we come up against these limiters, like Kant recognized. It's a psychological experience. It's finite. It's limited. It's unstable. Our ideas can change. We can be deceived. And so how do you justify making certain judgments, even about the very ground of your own rationality? And this is where the metaphysics of the transcendentals come in, and the analysis not of pure intuition, but the analysis of pure perfection comes into play. And I think this is where Bonaventure will use the notion of contuition, which is already rooted in that transcendental relation of dependency of being created a rational person, in any particular act of judgment. We're just simply specifying through abstraction and experience that prior existence or transcendental dependence upon God's creation as such. Or for Scotus, Bonaventure uses this too. Scotus will use the notion of pure perfections as implying a perfection that is spiritual, that doesn't in itself limit or become limited to merely categorical being. So the idea of love is not something that's limited to, although it occurs within categorical being. It's not something limited to categorical being. It's a pure perfection that is spiritual, and it inherently is indifferent to being instantiated as a concept or as a quiddity in a finite or infinite mode. But then they will argue on the basis of the principle of sufficient reason that any instance of a pure perfection in a finite mode requires some sort of infinite moded existence of that same perfection in order to explain its being. So this is where we get to the question of the essential order of being rather than an accidental order, or an essential series of being rather than an accidental series of being. Whereas, your father had you, you might have children, those children might have children. That's an accidentally ordered series simply because the action of your grandfather or your father, you are no longer dependent upon for your own very existence. But with an essentially ordered series, any action within that series that is posterior is concurrently, not just originatively, but concurrently and presently dependent upon that transcendental cause. And so we move then, if we experience and we can analyze the reality of pure perfection, spiritual perfections that don't imply any limitation, and we look for a cause, we cannot look for that cause in the order of history. We have to look for that cause in the order of metaphysics. And this establishes a transcendental, essentially ordered series, wherein the essentially ordered series, as manifested in creation, as terminating in our finite world, our finite modes of discovery and cognition, the very order that we recognize as essential, because the pure perfection that is finite depends upon a higher cause, both originating that reality in the finite order, but also preserving that reality and perfecting that reality in the finite order. Once we recognize that dependence, Father Peter says, and Scotus and Bonaventure said before him, that very recognition of an essential order carries within it a disjunct, or the disjunct between finite and infinite. And so going back to Rahner has an intuition of the natural existential, but because he prioritizes, and in a similar way, St. Thomas will prioritize, and Aristotle prioritized the processes or mechanisms of particular judgments about particular things. He has a difficulty in explaining any kind of metaphysical knowledge of being in itself, but he terminates with Christ as the explanation, because he's the instance of the fulfillment of those tendencies of the natural existential to infinity in the full acceptance of Christ of the supernatural existential, or which he calls the supernatural existential. Bonaventure and Scotus recognize the same difficulty. And so, but in the order of being, they recognize the priority of contemplative being, intuitive knowledge that they then articulate. But both of them will say that the purposes of created rationality, in a similar manner, but based upon different metaphysical principles, the very purpose of created rationality is discovered in Christ himself. And so with Rahner, where we're often stuck in Theologoumena, Bonaventure and Scotus, because they articulate the question of being and the way that we interact and resolve our understandings of being, they will say that dogma is truly informative and metaphysics is truly informative. But nevertheless, it still is ultimately dependent upon the revelation of Christ. As Gaudium et Spes says, I think number 22, man is fully revealed to himself, or in Christ, man was fully revealed to himself. So I think there is a, a genuine place for the anthropological shift or the center, because in that sense, if Bonaventure and Scotus are articulating at least a coherent understanding of being and the way that we interact and we know and speak being, if they're articulating even a coherent, but more importantly and more likely a correct understanding of being, then you're in a situation where the very purpose of creation, in some sense, is to situate human rationality, created rationality, as an existential and essential ontological argument for God. And what I mean by that is not a priori in the strict sense, but through man's reflection on the image in itself, as endowed with spiritual perfections of memory, intellect, and will, and a recognition of the finitude of that memory, intellect, and will, the inference of a dependency and an actuality of an infinite and perfect memory, intellect, and will, and an eternal Trinity becomes something much more plausible. And so Bonaventure and Scotus offer an account that allows us to see man as the center of creation, because man is uniquely endowed in a mediating, but also in a transcending way, all the perfections of creation, material, mixed, and spiritual, but also spiritual perfections of memory, intellect, and will, the capacity to know and to love in a boundless way. Man has these powers, but in the humble contemplation of being and the recognition of the disjunct between infinite and finite, in the recognition of that essentially ordered series, and thus the essential dependency upon the image, on the creator, of the image upon the creator, then one can recognize and affirm that there must be a creator. And then through revelation, that creator willingly manifests his purposes and even further names his being as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Son incarnate through the power of the Holy Spirit in a Marian mode. And so I think the fundamental critique is that Rahner does not accept, and neither did Maréchal, the Thomistic solution as such of the grounding of our knowledge. And thus there was motivated the critical question. Bonaventure and Scotus, and Bonaventure very clearly again in question 4, understood the critical question, but framed it in a manner wherein you start with contemplation, and then you move from contemplation as maybe analogous to consciousness or memory. From memory, it's this fecundative movement, but not a-thematic, because we already know that whatever is being contemplated is that which is in flight from nothing, to an articulation through abstraction, judgment, and reasoning, to a stated image-based declaration of the divinity of God. So we move from pre-scientific to scientific knowledge, precisely beginning in contemplation, then a mental speaking, a mental love, and returning to contemplation. So you find the dynamic of emanation, exemplification, and consummation circling and being continued through this progression of history in the created person. So, this touches upon, I think the central point is the difficulty and reality of the critical question, and the difference, the stark difference that Thomas, but especially Bonaventure and Scotus, because of the way they respond or anticipate the Kantian critique. This gets to the heart of whether or not we can say, because something is preconceptual, it is a-thematic. and that seems to be the assumption, is preconceptual means devoid of content. And the only way to get meaning then is through experience, process, history, change. And this is where Father Peter, when he critiques the neo-patripassionists, also sees problems. Because if you can't begin with being as, or at least arrive at a notion of being as infinite, well, then you will say, well, there's only life, vitality, and meaning through change. And change is something that is less than God. It can't be perfect. And then when you introduce the necessity of experience and change, and you affirm that we cannot say, we cannot speak or articulate a proper concept of God as infinite being. In fact, being as such in the foregrift or the preconceptualizing is A-thematic or meaningless. Well, then we're left to the processes of history and change, which is tied up in passion, suffering, imperfections, sin, in order to arrive at meaning. And then it's very easy, as the neo-patripassionists do, to retroject that process, that passion, that suffering back into the very life of the Trinity and somehow make process imperfection into perfection. And so I think that those two focal points is the priority of a psychological experience on the one hand, and the declaration that preconceptual or pre-abstractive being is A-thematic or meaningless. I think those are the two areas that Father Peter would have his deepest concerns. And I'll stop talking, but one more point to make is I think this notion of centering, Christocentric, is ambiguous, as Father Peter articulates when he's discussing Scotus's gentle correction of Bonaventure's sentence commentaries, because Bonaventure says the proper or primary subject of our theology is the whole Christ. It's the integral whole, the totum integrale of our theology. And Bonaventure says, well, if you take this in anything more than a metaphorical sense, what you're actually liable to do is to collapse God and the Trinity into the very economy. And he says that really and Bonaventure clarifies this both in the first part of the Breviloquium, but also in the last question of the De Mysterio Trinitatis. He will say the Trinity, or God, is the primary object of our theology, simply because he understands the distinction between God in himself and God with us. There is a distinction, and the economy comes into existence in its fullness, the economic Trinity, at the moment of the Annunciation. That's when the economic Trinity comes into the fullness of its existence. And so Scotus will say, actually, no, the primary object of our theology has to be something common to both the Word and to creation. And so he says the primary object of our theology then has to be rooted in the metaphysics of being, that to which essay is not repugnant, that allows us to speak of God in himself, because there is an order. God is first ontologically and volitionally, and creation is second as being constituted independency. And thus the entire economy of salvation is dependent upon God as the first, ultimately reduced to the Father as the first in the Godhead. And so this is why Scotus says it's not clear, it's not always safe to say in an unqualified sense that our theology is primarily the whole Christ, or the primary object of our theology is the whole Christ, simply because it will risk the Kantian problem of putting the Trinity into some sort of incomprehensible noumena on the one hand, and or collapsing the Trinity into the very economy, because you make the Trinity itself and God in himself, in terms of our theology, dependent essentially on the order of salvation history. And so these are some of the concerns that Father Peter and Bonaventure and Scotus already saw in especially Scotus on this point. And so it's not as though the whole Christ as the integral whole of our theology, if you mean all of its parts as the primary subject, is incorrect. But if you push it into a strict metaphysical statement, you'll end up collapsing the immanent Trinity into the economic Trinity, or you'll end up separating the two such that all we can know is the immanent Trinity and the economic Trinity, and we have to be agnostic about the immanent Trinity. And so they're trying to, Scotus especially is trying to say, no, there is something we can say that's common, even if their being in itself is infinitely distinct. So when we say being, we don't say that being as a substance or being as modified by accidents, being as finite. We just simply say being as that which is not repugnant to real existence. And then this can exist in either an infinite or finite mode. And that's why Scotus says there's a certain concern or ambiguity to Bonaventure's articulation at the beginning of the sentence commentaries.
Anyways, Doctor, I think if I remember correctly, we were also going to try and touch on some things from last week. Did you happen to have any notes that you wanted to address?
Yeah, you know, I did touch upon it. I think this notion of A-thematic versus thematic is an ambiguity. And I think Andrew said something to the effect that the notion of being is, I don't want to put words in your mouth and I don't want to misrepresent, but I got the impression that being or illumination was contentless. It was meaningless. And so when I was touching upon Rahner and some of, from a Franciscan point of view, the concerns that they would have with Rahner's notion of A-thematic, I think that covered my concerns with just the clarification that just because being is not stated as an abstracted concept in illumination, it nevertheless does not imply that it's devoid of any reality or meaningfulness, but rather that there has to be a prior acceptance of being and a contemplation of that to which esse or being is not contrary, or that which is in flight from nothingness. Because saying this is actually an inherently apophatic mode of communication, because I'm saying what being is not. But nevertheless, in saying what being is not already implies that I have some awareness, some consciousness, even if not articulated in an objectified way of what being is. So before I can say what being is not, flight from nothingness or contrary to existence, this is similar to that intuition of the contrary that Kant spoke of. But instead of being a merely agnostic intuition to the contrary, we're saying because of the relation of dependency, the principle of sufficient reason, the third principle of Aristotelian science, that if I can say what being is not, it must already mean I have some awareness, even if pre-conceptualized, of what being is. And that's what Bonaventure calls the light of reason, the illumination. And that's what Scotus calls being as such, even that's known intuitively, that's known through presence, but not through abstraction. You see what I mean? And so even in beatitude, we will not comprehend through a concept, an inner mental word, the infinity of God, but yet we'll have perfect knowledge of his presence and his light and his love, but we will never comprehend God. And so incomprehensibility does not equal total absence of knowledge. It means that the object exceeds our ability to cognize and conceptualize. And I think that's the fundamental mystery of this. And I think the opposition, the exclusive opposition of comprehension or incomprehension and knowledge as though they're contradictories. You know, if something is incomprehensible, therefore the opposite is knowledge, or the contrary is knowledge. I think seeing those in this relation of opposition is problematic, because there are plenty of things that we have knowledge of that we don't have comprehensive knowledge of. I mean, for one, what is matter? We all have knowledge of matter. We have intuitive, but also abstractive knowledge, but none of us comprehends matter. For us to comprehend matter, we'd have to comprehend the entire material universe and all its possibilities. But everybody knows matter, and everybody can say something positive about matter. At the opposite end of the spectrum, only God knows matter as such, because only God knows what it is in itself and what its true potentiality is. On the opposite end of the same spectrum, in terms of the finite world, what is the individual? What is the hexaetas or hexaety? Because we only know hexaety through the presence of the individual as existing, and that individual as existing manifesting powers, manifesting abilities to throw, to run, to speak, to laugh. But all of those are qualities or powers of our nature, which we all share. And since we share this nature, they're actually common. So then in their commonality, how do we know the individual? Well, we certainly do know the individual, but we can't comprehend the individual in that individual's potentiality, and in that individual's relation to others, and in that individual's relation to God. And so there are plenty of natural and supernatural mysteries, which are either absolutely incomprehensible or de facto, practically incomprehensible. That doesn't falsify the fact that we do have true knowledge of them. And so our knowledge as spoken to ourselves is always going to be finite. But Bonaventure and Scotus are very concerned to say is that this finite middle, this suspended middle of knowledge, is flowing forth from an infinite God in order to recapitulate and return through the Spirit to that same infinite God, who ultimately reduces to the fontal plenitude of the Father, this absolute first.
Yeah, I must no, thank you for clarifying that, Dr. Goff. I think maybe I just I must have communicated myself wrong. I was actually trying to I was trying to show that Father Peter critiqued those who held that the univocal concept of being was meaningless or contentless, but I don't think I filled in the gap in terms of, as you explained it today, that it's not contentless and it's not meaningless precisely because what it is that apophatic mode of being is that which is not repugnant to esse. Like that is the first thing. So it's not content in terms of we've already determined whether it's finite or infinite, but it's just this radical notion that being is not repugnant to esse, and I have to begin with that before I can even, without that I can't even begin to go on to distinguish the difference between infinite and finite. So I must have just not formulated my words clearly enough, so I do apologize for that. I did have a couple, I don't want to keep us going too long, but I did have a couple questions, maybe like for clarifications purposes, based on Father's presentation and then the discussion. One thing is, and I've seen this thrown around in Father Peter, the relationship between essentiality and existentiality, or essential and existential. And I know we talked about today how existential is just like being thrown in there, it's being, or thrown into the world. It's more just dealing with my personal experience of the world, and it's probably more empirically and psychologically based. I presume that when we're speaking of essentiality, that means essence, like beginning with metaphysics, that which is beyond just the empirical and my own personal experience and whatnot. So when we use those words essential and existential, you know, because whether we're talking about like an essential approach to something like a topic or an existential approach, do you mind like simplifying that in just, you know, basic terms? Because I don't know if I understand that fully.
Did you want to answer that, Father?
Yeah, just one word on that, but you will be more clear than me. For existentialism, existence is before essence. So what is important is not the essence, but the priorities on the existence. So being, as I understand it, being here and now. But maybe Dr. Goff will help us to understand what is the scholastic differences that has been made by Thomas at the beginning. Or it's not at the beginning, but on this particular difference between the ends or the essence, the thing, and the esse, which is existence on the word, if I understand well.
Yeah, I think briefly, as far as I understand, ens, esse, and existere, or existentia, refer to, if you go back to ens, it seems to refer to a substantial being, a substance in St. Thomas. And a substance is that which has existence for itself and in itself, and then modified by some sort of accidental perfections. So if you have a finite, if you have a dog, the dogness, the form of dogness informing the matter gives that matter the qualified, designated mode of being as a dog. And then the primary accident of quantity will then reduce that through matter into in with matter to a certain space or sphere of existence, a certain locality and dimensionality, and so on and so forth. So substance, quality, a dog will have fur or hair and will be able to bark, that sort of thing. So ens refers to primarily, as far as I understand, substantial existence, right? And esse seems to be that active existence. So esse is an infinitive verb that means simply to be. So it refers to that active existence. And existentia seems to be referring to the substance as existing outside of its cause. So existere, to stand outside of the cause. Now, with the Franciscans, it'll be similar. Ens seems to again refer to a whole being, like a substantial being. Esse, it has that mode of to be, but the emphasis in both Bonaventure and Scotus in the term esse, when they say esse, they're not primarily referring to existence. Whereas people like Gilson and following Gilson, when they see esse, they'll say being, or excuse me, existence. They'll take that as existence because they interpret that primarily as denoting or designating that active existence. Whereas for Bonaventure and Scotus, esse has a subtler, more unifying approach. And to the best of my understanding, esse refers to a being's reality as a certain kind or essence. So a being having reality with a certain esse or a certain essence or kind. And so the notions of both existence and essence are tied together in the functional use of St. Bonaventure and Scotus more so than St. Thomas with the term esse. So esse doesn't primarily or exclusively refer to the act of existence, but to the act of existing as this kind of thing. So when St. Bonaventure writes in the De Mysterio Trinitatis, the Deum esse or the Deus esse, it's not God's existence that he's talking about. He's talking about God's being, which is closer to the static notion of a substance existing as ens, but it has this dynamic force to it as actually existing. So God's being is God's existence as God, with the nature or essence of God. And existere or existentia is very similar as a subject or a substance existing outside of its cause. Okay, does that make sense? So there's a little bit of a subtlety in the use of esse. And so you have to be careful when you read like the De Mysterio Trinitatis or the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, when Bonaventure switches back and forth between ens and esse, he's referring to the same kind of reality normally, but under different aspects. So when he says ens, he's referring to a being, it seems. And when he says esse, he seems to be more referring to this being existing in this way, as this kind of being. You see the difference? One is more of it could be more of a static definition, and one is more of a dynamic active. You could say one is the nominative and the other one is the verbal. You see? So esse refers to the reality, the actual existence of a being as a certain kind of being. So existence and essence are linked up in esse in the Franciscan school. And so this is why when you see translations of Bonaventure, when they translate Deus esse as God's existence, it's better to translate it as simply God's being, his actual being as God, not just merely his bare concreteness, so to speak, as distinct from other beings. And then to that question of then, at least in terms of how I understand it, the reason why there's a critique of essentia or essentialism is because they take it in a kind of nominative sense, meaning it's just like a thing that's static. But reality is a life in motion, even in God. God is infinite perichoresis. He's eternally generating the Son. The Son is eternally being generated, and the Spirit is eternally. God never quits generating a son. It's not like we do. When I think of dog just now, and I speak dog, and then I go on to talk like I'm talking now, that dog is long gone. You see what I mean? Like I spoke dog and it's over. But with the Father, because it's an infinite act, he's always generating the Son. And the communication is always infinite. But in a sense, you could say that that act as infinite is perfect and complete, but that act is never completed as ended. The Father always generates the Son. And this is the mystery. So when many modern philosophers hear essence, they think of like my thinking of dog, and like it's just dead. We're all just essences. We're all just like inert things in reality. And so the existentialists want to say, no, what's really important is the concreteness and the termination of what we are as we really exist in the world. And so in relation to all these forces internally and externally. But I think Father Peter makes this fairly clear. And going back to that Bonaventurean Scotistic nuance of esse, I don't think essence has to be static. And in fact, essence is pretty dynamic when you understand it as the act of being. God's esse is to be infinite and infinitely Trinitarian. That's pretty dynamic. Our esse is to be a human person in relation to other human persons, angelic persons, to subpersonal beings, to God himself, right? And this is a dynamic process. But what we are is stable. What we are, our essence, explains the continuity of our existentia, our acts throughout our lives and throughout our different, and across and through and in our different relationships. And so I think the difficulty though into dealing with existentialism is what existentialism tended to do was not situate the essence and recapitulate it, and in this dynamic process of reality, it seemed to want to jettison it. And so what we're left with is a kind of agnostic flux. And so in some sense, like Heidegger says, we are on this horizon towards death. right? And nothingness. Ratzinger writes about this in his introduction to Christianity. And Nietzsche, annihilism. When you're a true existentialist, it's difficult to explain our beginning, our stable, continuous middle, and our end or purpose, because we're not sure what we are. We're just this moment at the leading edge of time, facing all these other different moments. Now, I don't think the existentialist consistently upholds this, because if they did, they wouldn't write their books trying to convince other people to be existentialists. But I think their point, their critique, is valid insofar as it locates a diminution, a kind of reification in the mind of what an essence is, and a forgetfulness that the only reason we have an idea in our mind is because this essence is actually out there in essay, in real existence and dynamic activity and interaction. And so I think it was a critique that perhaps went a little too far. It's a heuristic, but in point of fact, and it locates a genuine problem, but in point of fact, the solution might be worse, or the cure might be worse than the original problem. And Father Peter says, well, wait a second, if you're a mathematician or an engineer and you're going to build a bridge, but the essence of 2 + 2 = 4 isn't stable, you're going to have a serious problem building a bridge. And he says, in that respect, the continuity and the dynamic potential of essence is pretty exciting. It's not static. It's precisely the very continuity of ideas stabilizing within a process, at least in the finite order, that creates the very dynamism. So the essentialism of the Franciscan school is not opposed to existentialism in terms of the recognition of the foundational priority of real things. But it does emphasize that in order for there to be any real thing, it actually has to be a thing. It can't just be a point in a vector with no content, or a point in a line with no directionality. And so when Bonaventure and Scotus analyze the divine being, they arrive at the necessary existence, the necessary essay of God, because of the very perfection of his being. And so God must exist because God is so perfect, right? I'm shorthanding it. And in a sense, our essences are not so perfect that they must exist, right? So they're contingent and brought into reality through an act of creation. But insofar as we have a form or an essence that is stable, the fullest reality of that form precisely is in the independent, subsistent, existere of that essence. So existence is the perfection of any form. And anything less than existence itself for a form is a diminished mode of that form's being, unless that form happens to be in the mind of God, which reduces to the divine being itself. But you get my point, I hope.
I think this reminds me of what was it? The Man Who Was Thursday, when at the beginning, the anarchic poet is talking about how it would be so much more poetic if you get in the subway at one place and you have no idea where you're going to end up, which is like in the moment existentialism in that way. And then the response of, I forget his name, but the protagonist is, he says, no, the most poetical thing is you get in a subway and it ends up in a particular point and not just anywhere else. Like that's the marvelous thing, where like, it's like you put a pair of socks in a drawer and you come back 20 years and they're still there. Maybe it depends on the conditions, but like the idea that there's this the marvelousness of the perdurance and identity, and that there's, anyway, so that's sort of one point there. He also comments that the most poetic thing is not to be sick, which I think is probably a important point in our day and age.
Sick in body or in soul, I suppose, or in mind. You brought that point about the anarchic and the arche, and I think this is a very important issue with our discussion of essence, because ultimately the essence terminates in the Father, right? And so the perfect essence of God terminating in that first person provides us with not an anarchic, but a radically archic, or it provides us with an authority, an author, a source, or a principle from which all else flows. And so there's a beginning here that's rooted in the Father, precisely because the Father possesses in its fullness the divine essence first. And that unveils or opens up to an infinite and eternal Trinitarian relationship. And then it opens up ad extra into not just creation, but an appropriated arche that is divine sonship, because that divine son in his humanity always experiences his humanity as filiated from the Father, and all the Father's authority is given to that son. And so because of what the Son is, as generated by the Father, possessing the essence of the Father eternally, and generated by the Mother, possessing the created essence of humanity in time, and yet possessing that extended authority of the Father into creation, that allows for both the understanding of where we came from, the continuity and development through time and history, but also provides a person who stands in a position to manifest who and what we are to the deepest degree, and where we're all called to end back in that unity of the Holy Spirit, returning to the Father. So it's precisely because there's a twofold relation. It's precisely because we have both the who, the Son of the Father, and the what, the divine Son and the human Son of the Father and the Mother according to nature, that we have the possibility of this dynamic existential reality that we experience. So it's precisely by means of the essence as the principles of personal operation that the meaningfulness of reality comes to the fore. So it's not an either or, and in a certain way, epistemologically, we go through the essence, because the essence gives us an idea of what. But even as we're going through the essence of knowing what, we're always knowing that the through requires a term that it originates from and that it returns to. So whenever we think of the idea of dog, we're always knowing that any idea of dog we have comes from real dogs. And if there are real dogs, those real dogs were really created by an infinitely loving God. And so in that sense, we always know that all of our essentialism has vectors or relations, both horizontally in time, but also transcendentally and to God, but also eschatologically to the purpose and the full manifestation and consummation of why there's something rather than nothing. And that's found in Christ.
I guess, was there anything, I don't want to jump in when Father Joseph seems like he was wanting to say, but I just want to make sure that we touch on everything that you wanted to touch on from last week before we move out from here.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think that important distinction, and it came up naturally in Father Joseph's presentation, is the dispute. There is a real dispute on being as A-thematic or as meaningful.
I guess my question is, did you have anything else particularly from last week that you wanted to touch on?
No, that was pretty much it.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure that we didn't continue to pile it on. So it looked like Father Joseph might have had a question.
Yeah, maybe it's just like a sentence or on an opening, because I really appreciate what we talked today. And I remember Maréchal was talking about this incredible power of the mind, which is in Bonaventure, this is illumination, but the abstraction in Thomas is this process that we are abstracting the essence, so the universal, and from the particular, from the singular. So this power is from God for Bonaventure. So this power is illumination. And in our meeting, we are talking about Kant, and I'm sure part of the truth he gets in some ways on the Noumenal, because the critique of Hume, for me, in some ways, and the reality has shown that even if it's not true, in absolutely true, but it's in some way, we have the mind, the mind has to deal with time and space. So we have to deal with sequences of space and time. But the work of the Christian is to put together, not splitting, as the Protestant has done. So my thought tonight is maybe we can think of a correlation of three elements in order to baptize the Noumenal. And it could be, and I don't know if it's just I'm throwing it like this, but maybe the light in Bonaventure, or illumination process, the abstraction in Aristotle, fitting with, even if we can't know it, we can, and we have to say it. And that's why we can put it together with analytic philosophy, maybe. I don't know if I'm throwing it, but language. So maybe if we put together language, Noumenal and light, we have the answer of Kant. We have something to answer to Kant in saying, even if we don't even can get the intelligence on what is God, what is the sense of God, we can already, even we have to speak about it, and we have to ask God for his illumination, for saying not sciocchezze, as we say in Italian. I mean, non-nonsense sentences, but meaningful sentences on who is God and what he's doing for us on earth. That's it.
Yes, thank you. You know, one thing that is interesting about Scotus is that he departs on this question of language from the much of the previous tradition, at least scholastic, insofar as he argues that concepts are not primarily or not exclusively, ordered to the mind. So, you know, or words can also, let me back up. Words don't exclusively point to concepts in the mind. As many previous scholastics held, words can also directly point or index the thing in themselves, even if that thing is not comprehensible. And so in a sense, we can say Trinity and have it really refer as a revealed concept to the Trinity as such, and not merely to a concept in our mind or essentially mediated through that concept. And so we can enunciate a concept that directly refers, and this touches upon the power of language, the linguistic, the spoken reality, both in terms of revelation, but also the spokenness of creation. And then our ability to speak back to God on the basis of that creation and revelation in words that he gives us, even if we don't have a direct intuition or an abstractive comprehension of those terms. You know, looking at Hume, you know, I think it was Hume who woke Kant out of his dogmatic slumber. And Hume's critique is quite dreadful, especially coupled with, not dreadful, but devastating, especially coupled with Locke's sensism. You know, Locke says there's nothing really, you cannot come to a conclusion that exceeds the evidence in any way. and all evidence is based in some sort of sensory perception. And so there's a kind of epistemic limitation that's maybe more pragmatic or empirical than Kant, but it has a similar function. And then with Hume, he says, you cannot establish causation beyond just mere statistical or probabilistic correlation. And so he evaporates causality. An interesting passage that I once came across in Noumenon, and his response to basically, and especially Locke and Hume within that 19th century English kind of pragmatist context, was to say that actually it is rational to believe things we cannot necessarily prove through our experience, and that also that we have to reframe our notion of the grounds of causality. And so this was his grammar of assent, and he wanted to present it to a kind of an intelligent lay audience. But he has this interesting passage in a letter from before that period where he says, and he's speaking directly to this question of Hume, he says, what you call causes, I call effective wills. And this is the interesting point here that brings him right back into the Franciscan ambit, is the priority, the relative priority as the most rational power and thus most manifesting of personal reality is the will as self-determining. Because if you don't have the will as self-determining and free, even from eternity, God is always determining himself in his fullness of being. And thus he will never go out of order, because that will by which he's determining himself is identical to his infinite perfection. So it becomes a rule in itself, and there's no possibility of deviation or lack of order. But nevertheless, if you don't prioritize personal voluntary causality, you will fall into a kind of Humean skepticism about natural causality. And this is something that Bonaventure and Scotus both admit, because Bonaventure says that all creatures are primarily artifacts, of the Creator. And so in that sense, their structure and reality is primarily symbolic of the eternal Creator who created freely. And the causality that those and the powers that those creatures have, even at the subpersonal level, to act according to stable natures, is already dependent upon the effective will of God to both create those natures with such powers and to sustain those natures with those powers. And the uniqueness that a created person has as an image of God is that that person also has that kind of self-determining power in a derived or qualified sense. And so I think the insight here of Noumenon is to say, before we can talk about physical causality, we have to talk first about persons and personal causality. And this is very close to his analysis or his argument for the existence of God from conscience, that recognition of the two luminous beings, myself and God. But it also harkens to the priority in Scotus on voluntary causality, and in Bonaventure, the proof for God's existence, or the spiritual journey of the mind to God in the itinerarium, moving from the vestiges through the image, and then through the image into the name, and a discovery that God's name is both being and goodness. And goodness primarily referring to blessedness or beatitude, enjoyment, which can only happen through personal union in the will. So Hume's critique can be devastating, but when you prioritize and you recognize the fontal authority or arche of the person of the Father, who lovingly and freely generates, inspirates, then we can say, well, all being and thus all causality is situated in love, in this perfect, infinite love. So I guess the watchword is being. For the Franciscans, is being is higher than understanding, whereas for the Kantian, understanding delimits what we can say about being. Understanding is higher than being. I think it's esse altius est intellegere in the Latin.
Well, seeing that we've been going for 2 hours and 20 minutes or so, and seeing that the next part in the Theologian of Auschwitz by Father Fehlner is particularly about the metaphysics of the will, this might be a good point to wrap things up.
Yeah.
And so we'll start looking at the introduction to the next part in chapter 8, I think.
Yeah.
Which is the will in Scotus.
Did you want me to go over?
Right.
I could. No, it's no problem, because really the Rahner article and then the Patrapashian article, they're closely related on the question of being. With Rahner, experience psychology, and with the Patrapashianism trying to situate that psychological experience in an actual process of history. And so we're still dealing with the question of being, and I could maybe do 3 or 4 slides and hopefully get through it in 20 minutes, because it'd be really the same topics we've gone over today, but now extended into the economy of salvation and how that's understood. So they're very closely related in terms of the fundamental critique of getting being wrong and misunderstanding the order between contemplation and psychological introspection. So if that might be helpful, because it could really complement today's discussion in a different framework. So I don't know if that seems interesting.
I think
we could do it. I think I could do it briefly.
Okay, that'd be very helpful, I think, because those are issues that are very apropos. So
are we doing that for right now, or at the beginning of the next week?
So no, that'll be at the beginning of next week. So next week will be a brief presentation on Father Peter's neo-Patrapassionism.
Yes.
Basically, I think that'd be, to put names on it, Moltmann, Casper, and Bruno Forte, I think.
Yeah.
And then
big program.
And then from there, we'll go into
chapter 8.
Yeah, chapter.
The will.
So I think for most of the homework is to start on chapter 8.
Okay.
And then I don't know. I mean, I basically took this week off, so I can try and make some sort of initial summary, at least of the introduction for chapter 8.
It could be good.
All right. Well,
can I give you the benediction, or it's okay?
No, yeah. If we could finish with a prayer, I think we've finished our planning for next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Lord bless you and keep you. May he show his face to you and have mercy. May he turn his countenance to you and give you peace. The Lord bless you by the intercession of Our Lady, in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Saint Francis of Assisi,
pray for us.